Did you know that back in the day, the Bill of Rights did not apply to the states, only to the federal government? Did you know parts of it still don't? Want to find out why? Well, stick with me and I'll tell you. I'm Bryan and it's time for another civics lesson. We need to learn our civics, so share this, watch it, comment, get this out there so people will start to watch and people will start to learn because we're really going to need this information over the next few years. And with that, I give you the mixed up story of how the Supreme Court eventually managed to get the Bill of Rights to apply in some form to the states. So at the end of the 1700s, all the states get together and agree on a constitution, but it's split in half. On one side, you got the Articles. On the other, you got the amendments. Now the Articles are all about separation of power, splitting up the different branches of government. The amendments are all about individual freedom, keeping you safe from your government. But since at the time this was just a federal constitution, it was expected to only apply to the federal government. The Articles only apply to the federal government. Why not the amendment? There's even a big case called Bryan v. Baltimore where somebody tried to apply the Bill of Rights to a state government, and the Supreme Court said, nope, the U.S. federal constitution applies only to the federal government. End of conversation. Then we have this little thing called the Civil War. And after the Civil War, we write some extra amendments, which are called the Civil War Amendments, specifically 13th, 14th, 15th. The 14th has some special language in it called the Privileges and Immunities Clause. And lots of people think this is going to be a game changer. So what does the P&I Clause say? No state, we're talking about states now, no state can make a law that abridges the privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States. I mean, am I wrong? Or is the Bill of Rights a privilege and immunity of being a U.S. citizen, right? And if states aren't allowed to write laws anymore that abridge those privileges and immunities, that's a big deal, right? Well, the Supreme Court let us down in something called the slaughterhouse cases, which are not as exciting as they sound. You think it's going to be a horror movie, it turns out to be about a monopoly over slaughterhouses. But in the slaughterhouse cases, the Supreme Court said that these three amendments were written after the Civil War about slavery, and they only apply to slaves. This is still universally accepted as a pretty bad reading. Unfortunately, the case is still on the books and has never been overruled, unlike a bunch of other cases from that time that were equally shifty. So the Privileges and Immunities Clause is basically still dead, thanks to the slaughterhouse cases. And with that, the Bill of Rights goes back to applying only to the federal government. So a few years after the slaughterhouse cases, there's another clause in the 14th Amendment that the Supreme Court decides to use. The Due Process Clause. Any law student who's seeing this just went, due process is terrifying. There's a due process clause in the 14th Amendment, a due process clause in the 5th Amendment. There's procedural due process. There's substantive due process. Due process is confusing as all hell. For this video, I'm going to try to make it as easy as I can. Here's the idea. Before the government can take certain things from you, you are owed a process. That process may be a hearing. That process may be a form that gets filled out. That process could be any variety of things. But you are owed a process. That process is due to you. It is known as due process. Does that make sense? And if you don't get your due process, then the government can't take whatever the thing is. You have no idea how long we spend in law school trying to understand due process. It's a mess. I think that's as simple as I can do it. If it confuses you, replace the word due with owed. You are owed process. You are owed some sort of government action before they can take your thing away. Due process. The 14th Amendment Due Process Clause said something new. All right. No state can write a law that deprives a person of life, liberty, or property, which is a lot of laws, without due process of law. Well, what does that mean? While the Privileges and Immunities Clause would have taken the whole Bill of Rights and applied it to the states, this approach instead took one little right at a time and applied them to the states, case by case. This whole process starts with a case called Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, Inc., the city of Chicago. And this is kind of the first time the Supreme Court does this. They're going to take the word property and say, because of the 14th Amendment, the state is not allowed to write a law that takes away property without due process, essentially applying part of the Bill of Rights to Chicago. In Twining v. New Jersey in 1908, they start to expand this a bit and actually explicitly acknowledge that because of the 14th Amendment and this clause, the 8th Amendment may apply to the state of New Jersey. By 1925 in Gitlow v. New York, they're straight up saying parts of the First Amendment wholly apply to the states. And this just keeps going and going. But the thing is, nobody ever agrees to take the entire thing and incorporate it. And this has sort of been the argument ever since. People who would call themselves constitutional originalists are on one side, and others are on the other side, just kind of fighting back and forth over whether or not the Bill of Rights applies to states en masse. Now, you will find that this argument tends to get a little bit quieter when we start talking about the Second Amendment. But that's just sort of the way these things tend to go. At this point, portions of the following amendments have been applied to the states: the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, Sixth Amendment, and Eighth Amendment. And someday we may move back to the Privileges and Immunities Clause and just wipe the whole thing in. That would be ideal, or at least a lot cleaner. So anyway, that is how the Bill of Rights slowly became applicable to your state. I'll bet you didn't even know it wasn't fully applicable to your state. But these are the things you need to know. We got to learn our civics, people. Keep watching. In the next few years, civics are going to be very important, so please share this video and get it out there as much as you can. Thanks.